So in this presentation, I want to talk briefly about achieving the goal of this level. So the basic setup that I have in my game, and I would encourage you to think about, different variables, different mechanics. I mean, you don't necessarily need to follow along exactly the way that I have my game set up, but I'm just trying to work through some things so you see kind of the logic and the workflow of a simple game. So I have this rocket. It's starting off at the launch pad, and the goal is to get to the landing pad. Now, I have my landing pad goal here, and it's made up of just two objects. I just wanted, just two simple cube objects. The element on top is going to be the collider that I want to use as a trigger to let us know that we've reached the goal. So the way I'm going to handle this is with my landing pad selected, and again, this could be any shape and any piece of geometry. I happen to use this cube. I'm going to add a state machine to it, and this state machine, this is going to be my my goal detector, or I'm going to use this to kind of manage the interface or the success or failure of my game. So I'll just simply call this goal. And on state one, this will be my idle state, and for now it's going to simply listen for a collision event. So I'll go into physics, and I'm looking for a collision event, and I'll add that to my idle state. I'll add a second state, and I'll call this something like maybe my goal has been reached, okay? And I'll need an event, and I'll just call this, well, I'll call it goal. And when I go back to my idle state, I'll set the send event as goal, and I'll set this up as a transition. So in other words, right now when we have a collision event with this object, and I'm going to leave it untagged for now, but logic dictates that I'll probably tag this with player, and I'll set up the tag on the player object as a goal as well, so that if I have other objects flying through the air or projectiles, and if one of those hits this landing pad, it won't treat it as the goal's been complete. But for the sake of this demo, we'll just get a little proof of concept going here. So I have an idle with untagged object. When the collision event has been triggered, it sends off this goal. So we can test this already. And so once my rocket lands, try to get there as quick as possible. I almost ran into my landscape here. So you'll notice that at the top of the map I have a little mini map here. It's a little outside the scope of the project, and demoing that it would take a while to kind of go over that, but I will talk about some alternatives. So not a very good landing, but I did reach my goal, and so we've triggered that event. So I can use that to activate a little bit of text on screen. Now when it comes to text, I have a couple of different ways to introduce text. I've imported or I've made available some Photoshop content. I've made a menu folder, and inside my menu folder I have some objects that I've created as sprites. Now in order to create an object as a sprite, we covered this in a previous presentation, but I do want to drive this point home, that when you import a game object, so for example, I'll just take this Photoshop document that I have on my desktop, and I'll drag that in as an asset that I can use in my environment. Whenever you bring in either a Photoshop document, a PNG, or a JPEG of some sort, if I select that object or that resource and I go to the inspector, you'll see that the texture type by default is set to texture, unless you have your project set up by default as a 2D project. We had our project set up as a 3D project, therefore all bitmaps or raster graphics come in as a default as a texture type. Now textures can only be applied to 3D objects, so I can't just drag this asset inside the scene unless I'm going to attach it to an object. Now with that object selected, if I go to my inspector and I change the texture type from texture to sprite 2D / UGUI, at that point I can drag this asset in. I could drag it into my interface here. I could drag it into, I gotta hit apply, forgot to hit apply. Once I set it as a sprite and I hit apply, I can now drag this into my environment, or I can drag it into the hierarchy, and once I do that, just tap the F key to frame it. This is now a two-dimensional graphic. It's a sprite graphic that is registered to the Z space, so it points in the Z direction, okay, which happens to be the way that we set up our interface. or our project, we're looking down the z-axis. So now we have a sprite, a two-dimensional sprite that we can use. Now I did that same technique for my background graphic. Now I have this asset, and I could use this as my message reveal. Okay, so I have a choice now. I could go to Photoshop and I could make an interface. And once I have this interface set, I just did a real quick mock-up of a menu screen that I'll use. And I have some text inside Photoshop, so I have these different text elements. I don't want to turn this into a Photoshop demo, but I do have these simple text elements. And if I were to add another element, I'll just grab my text tool and say, I'll just type in start. If this start text is something that I want to integrate into my project, what I can do is I'll just grab this little marquee tool here, and I've mocked up an entire interface, and I've created this document at 1024 pixels wide by 768 pixels high. Okay, and if I just highlight the start, and if I make sure that I'm on the start layer, if I Command C to copy, I'll go to a new document and I'll set up the background. Instead of white, I'll set it up as transparent. I'll say OK, and now I'll paste the content. It's kind of probably hard to see in this presentation, but I've just pasted the start text that I've selected. In fact, if I fill that in with black temporarily, you can see that that's on a transparent background. So this is something that I can utilize. Fill that back with white. I can save this graphic out, this start graphic. I'll just save it. Well, I'll save it to my desktop, and I'll call this start. I could leave graphics as PSD documents. I could leave them as PNGs. I could export them as PNGs or JPEGs. The advantage of PNG in Photoshop is that it preserves their transparency. I can see the checkerboard pattern in the background. That means that those pixels are transparent in the background. I'll save this as start PNG. I'll hit save, and I'll say OK. I now have this start graphic that I can drag into an appropriate folder. With that start graphic selected, I can convert it from a texture to a sprite and hit apply. And at that point, I can drag this graphic in, and now I have something that I can use as part of an interface. Okay, so that's an object. It's a 2D sprite object, and I'll use this technique both for the reveal of my reaching my goal and also my start menu. Okay, so my start menu, again, I've mocked up inside Photoshop. You can use Illustrator and you can use other applications, just something to get a basic graphic going. So I have this ready for liftoff, and so we can choose yes or no. So we can either start game or quit the game. That's what the yes and no are going to represent. I'll just hide this start element. And then I just kind of mocked up this moon graphic in the background, and that's just I didn't export this entire document. I just wanted to mock something up to see how I should arrange it on screen. More about that in just a minute. So what I want to do is I want to jump back into my game, and once my goal has been reached, what I want to do is when I reach my goal, I want to be able to activate a simple bit of text. Now, I don't have my message ready yet, but ultimately my message is going to say we've moved. I'll use the start message, or maybe I'll just jump back into Photoshop and do this really quickly so you can see the workflow. I'll jump back into Photoshop. I'll borrow some of the screen space up here, and I'll just say we've moved. Okay, maybe I'll include my address. Even though I didn't move recently, that's what I'm going to use this project for. So I'm going to transform this text up, or I could have with the text tool, and while I'm making this text, I could go up here and just change these properties to something a little bit larger. Once I get the text looking the way that I want, maybe I'll go back to the text tool and I'll just throw a simple text warp on here and just get it to arc a little bit like I did with Ready for Liftoff. Let's back that down to something a little bit more subtle. There we go, just a nice little arc in the text. We've moved. And I'll just grab this marquee tool just to make a selection. And basically what I'm looking to do is just highlight the text that I want to pull out of the document. There's other ways to do this, but I think this is a pretty simple method. I'll Command C to copy. I'll make a new document. I'm going to call this We Moved. And I'll paste, and I can see in here, it's kind of hard to see because it's white, the We Moved graphic has just popped up. So I'll do a quick save as. I'll save this to the desktop. It would be more appropriate to save this directly to the project folder, but I'll just save it to the desktop, say OK, and now I'll jump back from Unity. I'm looking for the We Moved graphic. There it is. It's hiding over there, and I'll just drag that in. Once that imports, I'll select the We've Moved, and I'll change that from texture to sprite, and I'll hit apply, and now I have that texture that I can use. I'm going to go find my landing pad goal. I'll tap the F key to frame that, and now I'll just drag this We've Moved graphic into the scene. Let me just do it this way. I'll drag it into the hierarchy, and it shows up at 0, 0, 0. And I'll just kind of move this. I'll drag this over slowly. There's other ways that I could quickly move that over, but that'll just be the quickest and easiest way. So this is floating in space now, and I can kind of see where it'll just have it floating right above the landing pad, and this will be an element that I want to trigger. I'll just use that activate, just like I did in the previous presentation. So what I'll do is maybe I'll test this really quickly. I'll hit the play button, and I'm going to fly my rocket over there as quickly as I can. Maybe. See if I can get some altitude here before this little hill comes up. So I've built in a little mountain in here to make it a little bit more difficult to navigate. And I'll just crash. I don't have a mechanic built in for my crash yet, but once I get over here and land, okay, I'll just kind of, look at that landing. How about that? A little bit of a glitch or a bug that I'll want to fix, but so this gives me an idea of what it's going to look like on camera, and so I'll just kind of move, just kind of sliding this around, moving it closer to the camera, which is causing it basically to zoom in or scale. In fact, maybe I'll move it back and just kind of look at it through the scene view. Again, I've split my game view here, and I'll just line that up right over top of the landing pad, and rather than moving it around the Z space, I'll just bump up the scale. And I'll scale this in 2 along the X and the Z. So there we go, we've moved. And what I'll do is I'll do that trick of just deactivating the game object. Now what I'll do is when we go into the landing pad, oops, you know what I did? It's not going to save those changes that I just made because I left the play button on, remember? And that was something that we talked about way early on, that if it remembered the position coordinate, but it will not remember that scale. So let me just scale that back up to 2. That should work, and I could continue to kind of, tweak the design of this. Basically what I want to do is I want to make sure that's turned off, so its natural state is that the We've Moved is turned off. If I go back into my landing pad, and this is the place that has the goal, once we reach the goal, what I want to do is I want to activate a game object. I'll activate game object. And I don't want to use owner. I'll specify a game object, and I'll grab the We Moved, and I'll make sure that it just flips on and activates when we land. So the result here is that we'll get this message once I eventually get over there and land. It'll take just a moment to get there, and this is kind of why you want to build in a shortcut when you're developing your game, so that you can quickly get. There we go. Even though I landed sideways, probably should explode if I land that way, but there we go. We've moved, and maybe I'll have a little address or whatever kind of message you want to include here. Alternatively, what we could do is I did provide some 3D text somewhere in these models, and if I wanted to integrate something into my project, let's see here. I'm gonna zoom way over here. I'll zoom in, and I still have my text object selected, and so what I'll do is I'll move to view. There we go, and that just brings the text over to whatever my view is, and I'll flip this around 180 degrees. What I could do is I could take all these letters and I could pluck out the letters that I want, and I could build a custom message in 3D. I could add a rigid body to these, and when I land on the goal, I could activate the rigid body or turn on gravity and have the letters fall out of the sky. So there's a lot of things that I could do. I'm going to stick with that 2D method because it'll be a nice primer for our menu interface that we're going to do. So that's the basic overview of how I'm going to reveal my message. Again, I'll leave it up to you to design what that message is and what the goal is, and all those little odds and ends. One other thing that I do want to mention really quickly is that We're making a game, and so we want some kind of resource to manage. And so whether that, in this project that I've created, it seems to me a couple of things that we might want to manage. One, I might want to manage fuel. So every time I press the left click, I could be burning fuel. So I could have some kind of fuel indicator up here. I could also maybe manage time. Maybe I have a set amount of time that I have to complete and get to my goal before I'm unsuccessful or successful. And also maybe I have a resource where if I crash, it starts to take away hit points, or maybe I just crash one time and I explode. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to have to decide. What's the gameplay? What's the core gameplay concept here? So those are the kinds of things that I want you to think about. Think about a resource to manage. Maybe it's health, maybe it's time. I'll leave that up to you to kind of work out the details of that. We'll conclude with our final presentation that deals with the menu, building a user menu or an application launch menu. And then we'll build this project and we'll be done with the proof of concept. So we'll do that. We'll catch up in the next presentation.